Welcome to the Thank You Life podcast. Today's guest is Joe Moore, the CEO and co-founder of Psychedelics Today. Psychedelics Today is one of the world's leading platforms for psychedelic media in education. Joe is a seasoned speaker and is also a board member of the Psychedelic and Pain Association and the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. In this conversation, Joe shares a lot about his own story of how he eventually found psychedelics, and they also talk about what's possible for humanity. How can we use psychedelics as tools for targeted problems and to find solutions to those problems in a more efficient and maybe more out-of-the-box way? They discuss a lot of the overall landscape of the psychedelic industry right now, from policy to accessibility, and Joe also shares several groups that he's a part of right now, including Remap Therapeutics and Psychedelics and Pain Association. You can visit psychedelicstoday.com. I recommend signing up for their newsletter, a lot of great content on there. They share a lot of really great media in the psychedelic space, and they also host a podcast. So definitely check out psychedelicstoday.com and Psychedelics Today podcast. And with that, we hope you enjoy this episode with Joe Moore.
Thank You Life is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was started by myself and Dr. Dan Engel in 2022 as a financial assistance fund for psychedelic therapy. Psychedelic therapy is expensive and 95% of the US population cannot afford its costs. That's where we come in. We partner with over 100 ketamine clinics throughout the US to help clients who cannot afford this treatment. In 2024 alone, we gave over $250,000 away to help 115 people receive this life-changing treatment. This work is not cheap, and it is life-changing. If you feel inspired to give or to become a monthly donor to help more individuals access this treatment, please visit thankyoulife.org/donate or email our Director of Philanthropy, Meredith Thomas, at meredith@thankyoulife.org. Every bit counts, and small monthly donations are especially important to keep this work moving forward. If you can give even $10 to $25 a month, you will join our community of contributors who are changing the lives of so many. Thank you all for your support. This episode of the Thank You Life podcast is proudly supported by Enthea, a mental health company dedicated to providing access to safe and affordable psychedelic-assisted therapy. Like us at Thank You Life, Enthea is committed to removing health equity obstacles that impede access to impactful mental health care. Enthea is a third-party administrator specializing in innovative mental health benefits for employers, including access to ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. As the first and only provider of advanced mental health solutions for the workplace, they enable companies to expand their benefits to include breakthrough therapies that address root causes of mental health challenges. Visit enthea.com to learn more. And now, back to the show. All right. Welcome to the Thank You Life podcast, everybody. Today we're here with Joe Moore from Psychedelics Today. And I appreciate you taking the time. As a place to start, I'm curious if you can share with us about what's happening right now with Psychedelics Today and your vital trainings.
Yeah, thank you for that. Right now, we have our vital program kicking off on February 17th, I believe. It's the 5th round that we'll be running it. We developed that to be competitive with the highest end of the programs out there, largely informed by Kyle's training as a somatic therapist, and also kind of the Groff breathwork format that he and I have been playing with for a very long time, and our own personal insights, right? So like harm reduction, integration tricks that are probably newer than Groff was writing about, and trying to inform people on the latest in neuroscience as well as develop community. Probably the biggest magic there is bringing people together who wouldn't necessarily ever be in the same room, like a yoga teacher and an anesthesiologist, for instance, having the same level of training, and then a diversity in their network, right? Because most doctors spend a lot of time with other doctors, right? And how do we bring back some humanity and connection? And I find that magical. And we're really drug agnostic. People can, research for themselves, and also model and technique agnostic. So we teach kind of the fundamentals, and we talk a lot about non-directive approach, but we also say, perhaps there's cases when there's a time to be more directive. So it's a year-long program. People can learn more at vitalpsychedelictraining.com or psychedelicstoday.com. And more largely at Psychedelics Today, we're trying to figure out what our next set of media projects are. We've done a couple books. We've done a TV show. We might want to do a documentary. We're kind of shopping around ideas right now to see what we want to land on. Because there's so many great stories left to tell. And there's so much positive influence left to be had in this space, right? So we have this window of time before groups like Pfizer, Moderna, J&J start deploying their own psychedelic compounds. So we can shape a lot of this culture around it to hopefully create some sort of at least cultural moat to keep ourselves safe and able to keep going. Yeah. So that's kind of the story. 2 podcasts a week. We have some regular writing.
Cool. You have a couple follow-ups. Yes, I was going to ask about the training and the medicines. So it sounds like it's a very broad overview, and then the breath work is what's used for an experiential component. All virtual, it sounds like.
So we don't super love virtual breath work. And our format of breath work is really intense. And so
I'm sorry, I guess I meant
really
virtual
unsafe
for,
doing that. Yeah.
Is the training virtual?
The training is very online. Yeah. So we have some in-person events that we'll throw in. But you could be in Singapore taking this training and not have to fly to the States at all. But it's a really global scene. We do have an experiential requirement. We want people to have an experience. So we work with you to make suggestions, and we don't necessarily want you to just shop on the internet for a little bit and pick an ayahuasca center. You can, and you can talk to us about that. But there's some major possible risks without having a place vetted. So we try to make sure folks are safe. And there's a conversation recently about being able to provide legal experiences with a number of other psychedelics in a GMP format. So you can actually have a doctor prescribe you these things in a very specific container for your training. So we're trying to figure out how to do that.
What is GMP?
We'll share more on that soon. Good manufacturing practices. It's the pharmaceutical grade MDMA, pharmaceutical grade LSD, things like that. So it's not dark web or an unregulated market. It's very regulated LSD or MDMA or whatever it is. So these things are coming. It's happening in the underground now. And I think there's an angle here where prescribers are themselves coming through our training and others who are similarly cautious. They don't want to use unregulated drug supply. They only want to use a safe, known drug, right? The good chain of custody. And there's some good reasons for that. But I don't want to say that's universal for everybody, but I wanted to figure out how to make that available because it's a little rare right now.
Yeah. Are you able to share a little bit more about that process and how they're even able to do that?
So governments would give approval to certain groups to operate. And then you'd need to find a manufacturer who can make those drugs and then figure out how to import them, which is a really painful process. Going over, international lines with highly regulated stuff. There's a whole thing there where I remember talking to an MDMA manufacturer about shipping to Australia, and the hurdles were unbelievable. So we probably won't do it in Australia. The pricing's too insane and the regulations are too insane. But so it's really high end. It's as if it's effectively made at a really intense drug manufacturing facility with extraordinary low margins for error built into their processes. And it's, as safe as it can get from the drug itself side.
And are y'all rolling that out now, or is that a future thing? I'm curious just for you to clarify that.
I'm hoping to implement it. I'm hoping for 2025 for that.
Wow.
But that feels a little aggressive, but I think there's a chance we can pull it off.
Yeah, I would love to just stay abreast as to what happens with all that. And it's really fascinating. And then the other thing, to jump into like the Psychedelic Today piece that you were sharing is,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how, essentially, like, what's y'all's mission? It seems like a lot of it is oriented around education, advocacy, and media.
Mm-hmm. So I just so I don't misspeak, I pulled up our mission, vision, values document. It was a very intense exercise, but on the high end, it's we want to create a future. This is quoting it, where human experience matters, and we want to help be a platform and a resource for like paradigm shifting ideas, because in a lot of ways we're still operating very old paradigms. Like in a lot of fields of medicine, we're still operating in kind of this like pre-Einsteinian frame, pre-quantum frame, and like very kind of mechanistic. And we want to go a little further and keep helping progress that. And then we want to help leverage the potential of holotropic states, because we go a little broader than just saying psychedelic states, and in non-ordinary states that could be like, let's just get dizzy, and like, is that potentially healing or helpful? And anyway, it's not necessarily the case. Could be fun maybe for a minute, but it's different. And we want to use this to like help both people and planet, right? We're in the middle of a huge planetary crisis, and how do we make sure we can survive? But some of our values supporting that are cognitive liberty, harm reduction, equity and inclusion, and human experience, regeneration, open-mindedness. So we want to. It took like years to put all that together in a really helpful way for us, but we really want to help enable this ecosystem. We want to help steward things so it doesn't stay purely in a clinical frame. We want people to have to be included from religious frames and traditions that predate this whole movement, right? Like if we look at all the indigenous traditions, we look at kind of like Zach Leary once on stage said something like he's representing the hippie indigenous movement. He had a better word than that, but it's like, there's this movement that was kind of self-created that they all just figured out on their own, and it worked mostly fine. Like, yes, there was fallout, but there's always going to be fallout with this kind of stuff. And like, how do we kind of have inclusion for all stakeholders here? And have people be safer, not go to the hospital as much, both psychiatric wise and from like acute medical things.
Totally. Yeah, and I love that phrase that you said, enable the, what would you say? Enable the industry, essentially?
Ecosystem, probably. Yeah. Like, how do we make sure people understand what's possible and understand who else is out there that might be able to help them on that? Like, who can you collaborate with to make your dreams come true? It's, the participation thing, radical inclusion, kind of the burner ethos in a lot of ways. Just how do we do some of those values in the real world, to help as many folks as we can, to help the planet and help, the next, hopefully thousands of generations, if we can make it that far.
Oh yeah. Love it. Yeah. And, I found you guys probably around 2018, 2019 as I was getting out of grad school. And I've just been very appreciative of y'all's, mark in the space and what y'all are doing. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got a relatively early start with us. That's great. I think we've been going for almost 9 years now.
Wow. So I would also love to jump back in your personal story a bit. And I'm curious what feels like a good place to start for you. On one hand, I'm interested in how you heard of and then got interested in psychedelics, and kind of where that came from. If that came from, I think I've seen a lot can be two different places, people suffering from their own kind of mental health stuff, looking for answers. And then on another side, more just a kind of like an exploratory curiosity that that leads them to it. And I'm sure there's a lot more options than just those two, but I've just seen those two a lot. So I'm curious what all that kind of those beginnings specifically around psychedelics or just your own healing were for you.
I think the first time I started hearing about these things, some really clever police officers brought a bunch of LSD, PCP, and more to my 6th grade class to show me how interesting they were as part of the DARE program, And I was like, oh, wow, these things are fascinating. What is this? And then they had, these kind of like addiction programs where people would, instead of jail, go do like a speaking tour to a bunch of schools. And I remember this one guy like just talking on and on about how scary and horrible LSD was. And I'm like, I'm going to have to learn more. And then, kind of pause for a little bit. Like, I think Eminem had some songs about it while I was in high school. So I was like, this is interesting. What is this? And then, in my freshman year of school, I was reading this book, Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. And there was a number of sections about Stan Grof's work and, talk about paradigm busting. And I, big fan of the X-Files, all sorts of weird kind of spooky, numinous stuff. And then the story that was told in that book looked something like an exorcism to me. And I'm like, not exactly a spiritual or religious person. I was very conventional at that point. And the idea that a professor at my university, who I thought was pretty amazing, was introducing me to these concepts through this book made me have to question, like, okay, is he full of shit? Is this real? And I went to the library, and thankfully, small state school in New Hampshire, we had a bunch of Grof books. I would like to know who put them there. But that's a mystery for another day.
Sorry, so the holographic universe, that was given to you by a professor.
That was assigned reading for our intro to philosophy course. Yeah. So he was a big, so we're on the tails of the Matrix, and he's drawing analogies to Plato's allegory of the cave. And then, he's a big time transcendental meditation person, and they have all sorts of interesting thoughts and dogma that I always thought was interesting, but I never went down that path. It just didn't pass my sniff test for a lot of reasons. And then, peripheral. I'll always stay peripheral to it because it's super interesting. So it kind of matched up with some of the other stuff he was saying. Like, I was never really not a believer in the ET topic, having been such like a UFO fan from X-Files. And then, funny enough, my grandfather was an Air Force captain at Roswell during the incident, but he kept his mouth shut and just kept feeding me mystery. So I'm like, okay, something funny's here. And, I don't know what to do with that other than my antennas are up and I'm watching. So I start reading Grof, right? And I have no business reading something like that as a freshman in my undergrad in a philosophy program. But I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this because this is the most interesting reading I've ever encountered. Started joining listservs. Found my breathwork teachers over in Vermont, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson at Dream Shadow. And
can I ask you what
we started doing
was?
holotropic breathwork. 2003 is when I started going to do breathwork. I started my undergrad in 2001. So there's some other interesting stuff with 9/11 happening, a couple weeks after I moved out of my parents' house. Oh, the world's very different than what I expected to have inherited now. And it's a strange time.
Yeah. Wow, that is fascinating.
And, off to the races.
Yeah, there's some similarities here to my own story, and you were a little bit ahead of me. I started high school in 2001. But yeah, one thing that one little interesting parallel. So I had a friend who in undergrad he was going to the University of Maryland and was given the book Breaking Open the Head by Daniel Pinchbeck to read. And then he told me about Pinchbeck's book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And I basically started reading that book while I was getting very into kind of all of these different topics, from psychedelics to spirituality and all kinds of other things. And that book resonated with me so much and really kind of took me to the next level of my own kind of journey. That's so curious that these kind of institutions can sometimes just click something on and set us off in these other directions. So,
yeah.
Okay, so you're in undergrad and really kind of just sounds like opening your mind to a lot more possibilities than it sounds like you grew up with in terms of Groff and breathwork stuff. And yeah, kind of where did it all go from there?
I thought I wanted to be a MAPS trained therapist, as early as 2004. And I didn't really want the restriction of having to go through that process. I was too interested in other things going on in the world, in particular doing stuff outside with my friends and, adrenaline sports and having a really, really epic time. I also had been interning in software since age 16. So I had kind of immediate path into a software career as soon as I got out of school. So I kind of just did that because it paid all right, and I had certain levels of freedom that I wasn't going to. If I did grad school, there was going to be a lot of potential limitations on me that I didn't want in terms of time constraints and where I could live and all that kind of stuff. This is very pre-telehealth. So I, kind of just some sort of strange feral mystic, right? Like running around doing this stuff. And I think at a certain point, I was like really fiending for community outside of my breathwork community in Vermont, which was amazing. It just, I thought I could do some good work, and I started, here's a funny story that kind of led to this moment. I would, at the beginning of podcasting, I think it started around 2003 or 4. I didn't really discover it till like 2006, maybe 2005 or 6, with Psychedelic Salon. And there's like this whole constellation of other podcasts with like, who were they? Sancho and Cody, and like, it was just like a podcast network that was all just kind of like cannabis and psychedelic related. And I loved it. And there was a lot of McKenna talk. And eventually I found Psychedelic Salon, and I was going to sleep almost nightly with Terrence McKenna, Sasha, Tim Leary in my head. And often all day too, because my software work wasn't all that demanding on me. So, just endless exposure through hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours of content. And then I started hearing about people doing events, larger psychedelic events in Atlanta that seemed like practical and accessible. And here's a bridge back to your story, is it was all kind of like Pinchbeck related via Reality Sandwich and Evolver. And there's a number of people like Ken Jordan, recently deceased from Lucid News, who were involved in that. And they were very welcoming.
Let me just pause you for a
very
second.
happy to have me doing. Sure.
You know what's so crazy is I went to Georgia Tech. So all this was happening for me in Atlanta. And I knew this, my one dear friend, Maya Lemberg, who is a psychedelic therapist now. And she was my one friend, kind of not from Georgia Tech, who brought me into those, those little pods, those little communities of Evolver and Reality Sandwich. So I wonder if we were in the same space at some point. And for me, that would have been like 08, 09. But yeah, that is wild.
That's cool. And that's like, we were definitely at the very least interacting online. in my opinion, because Maya was a big influence there.
You're listening to the Thank You Life podcast because you're interested in hearing inspiring stories about people's personal growth, transformation, and healing with psychedelics. And that's awesome because those stories are really powerful and they deserve to be heard. But if you are anything like me, you are also interested in what's happening out in the world to make these substances, these medicines, more accessible and available to everyone. So my name is Henry Winslow, and I created a free email newsletter called Tricycle Day that helps you do just that. Every week, I send 2 issues that take about 5 minutes to read, so not a huge time commitment at all, but they'll get you caught up on what's happening in psychedelic research, policy reform, and this emerging industry that's unfolding in real time. So if that sounds like something you would like to check out, just go to tricycleday.com, and there you can enter your email and you'll be good to go. So with that said, I'm super happy to be supporting Thank You Life, and let's get back to the podcast.
This episode of the Thank You Life podcast is proudly supported by Dr. Bronner's, a brand that believes in more than just making great soap. As a dedicated corporate sponsor of Thank You Life, Dr. Bronner's is helping us break down barriers to mental health care, advancing our mission to providing life-changing access to psychedelic therapy for those in need. Together, we're making healing possible for underserved communities across the country. So next time you see that iconic bottle on the shelf, know that Dr. Bronner's isn't just providing that refreshing shower. They're also invested in improving access to mental health care for everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bronner's, for being a true partner in healing. Visit drbronner's.com to learn more. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I started hosting events in, some anarchist loft in Chinatown, Boston, because they gave me really flexible rates because, sometimes anarchists don't have money. I was like, okay, like any donations I get, you guys just get to keep. I'm like, cool. And I spent a lot of money to make this happen. I definitely went pretty majorly into debt to do all these events, but I'm like, I learned so much. So maybe that was my grad school. So I'm kind of like bringing this energy from the Groff breathwork for like how to run circles. And I, sometimes I would do like a 5 to 10 minute primer talk just to get people like ready to have deeper conversations. And I would try to like facilitate conversations for a couple of hours and connection because, people were doing ayahuasca at that point, but they didn't know where to land. They didn't have like a ground, right? Or they were curious and it's like, where do you go? And so like, how do we build that community? So I, had some like permaculture things going on. So like, in the morning, how to grow fish at home. So you have like some sort of stable reliance, I guess food system autonomy. And then the second half would be like how to grow mushrooms at home. And, cheap sliding scale events. And then, as far as getting Graham Hancock there to give really interesting talks on therianthrope concepts from like the cave paintings. And that was dope too. And then, that's kind of was one of my access points. Like in part, Kevin, I was trying to find drugs, but also it didn't work. I was trying to find psychedelics. I'm like, how do I get involved in this burner community? Made a lot of really great lifelong friends, but also like didn't exactly get what I was aiming for, but I got a lot more than I bargained for. Eventually moved out to Boulder, tried to do the same thing. Turns out Boulder was a extraordinarily competitive landscape in this kind of like new agey situation. So I had very little success and tried in Denver for a minute and then moved up to the mountains. But I kind of like maintained this connection through the community through being a board member at the National Psychedelic Club organization, which had a really big footprint at CU Boulder and still has a really major footprint at Denver. The Denver Club is extraordinary, but I don't know that the national organization is doing much anymore. I think the more interesting work's happening at Global Psychedelic Society right now.
Sure. So when, like in all of that, when were your first psychedelic experiences? And are you open to sharing a little bit about those?
Yeah, I have a hard time getting my history straight sometimes, but I think I was growing mushrooms in maybe 2007. I started growing. We didn't have these sterilized grow bags at this point. We had to really work to find the techniques and understand what everybody was writing about. And then, I tried to have a few solo sessions, and I don't know that it worked out well. But my first big experiences were breathwork. Like I had a lot of really big breathwork experiences. And in the graph format, you have usually at least 3 hours for your experience. My biggest one was probably like 5 hours, 5 or 6 hours, just like deep in it in a really harrowing way. It was really helpful in the long run. Terrifying and terrible in like the classic sense of that word, but really kind of endlessly thankful for those moments. I need to get my chronology straight, but this is all kind of before psychedelics. I think I did 6 years, 5-6 years of holotropic breathwork before jumping into the psychedelic arena in a real way. But my first real experience was ayahuasca. I found some community in New York State that was around for a long time, and a number of friends liked it enough to suggest it. So I was like, okay, with all this breathwork training, I think this is one of my next steps. I was struggling with some depression due to some relationship issues at the time, and this is funny. I show up, it's in a beautiful temple, and I sit down, get the sleeping bag going. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be in this for a while. I just want to be ready. The guy next to me is like, I'm just so happy I'm sitting next to you. You've clearly done this a lot. I was like, no, I'm glad I'm putting off that energy, but no. I just know for sure it's going to be super intense. But I know that I've been through a number of super intense things in the past. So I'm like, okay, I think I got this, but holy hell. And then, as the stuff's coming on, I ask the shaman for the biggest dose he's willing to give me, and he eyeballs me for a while. He's like, okay, fine. I was like, oh God. All right. Proceeded to have like 30 to 45 minutes of the most sheer terror I could have imagined at that point. Like the come up was like extraordinarily terrifying, which I think is classic with
a step up from your holotropic
that level of
terror.
fear. Not even a step up, like a different league of its own in terms of terror for me.
Yeah.
And I think this happens when people have like assorted entity encounters. And this was in fact some sort of entity encounter, but it was such like an alien thing that it was hard for me to characterize it as an entity at the time. But it was like this interface with some reptoid and sectoid thing that was like a very different order of being from me, checking me out. And the fear was that my eternal soul was lost forever, and I don't think that was true. I think it was just a transformational moment. Fuck no. And like I think this is like an archetypal thing, right? Like as an archetype shifts into something new, like the death of the old makes us think everything's done forever, but in fact it's like the birth of the new, and very similar, which is like kind of like birth process.
Yeah, it's like, and that classic like ego death idea is that essentially, right?
Yeah. And then I was really fascinated by the purging experience, which is like there's this concept of like fighter pilots when the G's are like forcing all the blood out of them, and they're like just flirting the line of like blacking out, and then they come back. But it was like I was getting squeezed out like a towel, and like down to like a base point of awareness, and then back, and it didn't last super long, but that was like the transition. It's like, okay, that part's done, and then like what's next? And it was just like surfing the most intense wave of content and emotion. Like for whatever reason, I was having this like metaphor of like big wave surfers. Like if you fall, you're dead for sure. So like don't fall, just be with it, be in it. And like, I'm sure it would have been fine if I lost it, but like that was the sense I was getting in the experience, and working through all sorts of like, mundane life stuff, and then having experiences of my ancestors, and just popping in to say they love me, and then, interesting little vignettes that suggested past lives, but I'm like, I still don't know what to make of that exactly.
Yeah.
But high alpine Peru is all I was, the character of the experience for me with a family, which is interesting.
Wow.
Some childless and plan to be that way for a long time if possible. But I think, it was a fascinating experience. And then, near the end, as things were kind of like chilling, like the whole world was like, just, getting a sense of just the innate value of everything, of all existence, and just how valuable things are. And, we don't really think of a wall as being like incredibly valuable, but everything in the room was, the whole world was, diamonds everywhere. And, then I, had it was an interesting shift. People started driving home to the big city. And I'm like, what? Same day? What is happening? And this is like not part of my training, because I've read all of Groff. I've read, been in this culture for a while through reading, but then seeing everybody kind of like break up and like go home same day. I'm like, there's something fundamentally wrong with that, in my opinion, but I'm perhaps a little conservative. I don't really like it when people drive same day on drugs. So, I was like, okay, weird. I'm going to pay the $10 and sleep over. It's an easy enough decision. And, had a beautiful meal with some of the leaders the next day. I was like, oh, this is lovely. And yeah, that was my first big one. And my depression was gone for a long time, like probably at least 2 years from one session. I'm not the kind, Kevin, that's like, I need to do ayahuasca monthly or quarterly or even twice annually. Like, I've only ever done it that once. And what my takeaway was is, okay, like, it helped me a lot. If I need it, I know where to go.
Totally.
And one way I frame this is like, a lot of people end up on a sort of mystical path, or they end up on like this, like, endless loop of self-improvement, which can be nice for a while, but you got to get back to living at a certain point. Because the world needs you, and then there's this other frame of like, it's one of very many mystical paths that you could be, or like spiritual paths that you could be taking, and like it's very interesting, it's very intense, very transformational, and it's hard, and it's available. It's like, that if you drink this thing, you're going to have a big moment. But a lot of mystical traditions, there's a lot of effort that has to go into it, right? I was reading about some Sufi stuff the other day where they have to, like, once or twice a day meditate and draw one of the many names of God on their heart 66 times, visualizing that. So like, to make a connection to a higher thing. And that's a lot of work. It's not the most work, but that's a lot of work, relative to drink this, lay down, pay a few $100 or more, and then you're having the biggest experience ever. It's like, this is something I've been in dialogue with myself about for a long time, because I spent a lot of time studying, Greeks and being mentored in that kind of like ancient world frame. And like, a lot of these folks in the Eleusinian mysteries, maybe they only had it like once or twice in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like, from the little bit I've read about those, like at least like a year of prep, if not the whole life prepping for it, but.
Yeah. It's, what a thing. And what a build up. Like the secrecy, I think it was roughly around at least a 2,000 year history, if not like a 2,600 year history of these mysteries. And there's still so much we don't know. Like the level of secrecy is unparalleled. Like the CIA doesn't have that level of secrecy, nor the Freemasons. You know what I mean? Like, it's amazing.
Yeah, I really, the kind of word in my mind about your experience is like, wow, like the whole gamut. Like you really got the whole gamut, from the terror and the purging to, the flood of content and emotions, to the more, what you might call more like beatific spiritual experience at the end, seeing the inherent value of everything. And yeah, amazing. And it also like talk about preparation and not needing to do it all the time. It sounds like in some ways you were prepping 5 years or so with the breath work and really kind of preparing.
Trying to level up on the Greeks, I guess. Kidding. I don't know. I just couldn't find my way in.
Oh, right. Yeah. You were trying to do it sooner. I think there's really something to that though. And I can definitely relate to that. When I just had a big experience recently, and in some ways it's like, wow, yeah, I show up and it was just this one experience that was so transformative. And I also know that like, it wasn't just that. It was, I mean, for me, the content that I faced, which was this really kind of young, terrorized infant part that was just in such terror, was like 10 years of poking around at that part and getting to know it from the outside in bit by bit. And then this experience really took me to the center of it, which was difficult, but also amazing. But that, yeah, it's like, it was that one experience, but it was also, I was ready to have that experience. And it that experience didn't just fall out of the sky, so to speak. It was all just the right moment in a whole process of things.
Yeah, there's often a lot of like faith that goes on with it, and like sometimes it comes to you. Sometimes you have to work really hard to find it. Sometimes it's like, definitely the wrong time too. I think one of our frames, and maybe you have this in your world, is we say things like, are you able and willing to have your life substantially disrupted for a bit of time? If you're going to jump into this pit, and like, are you able to have space for that? Like I hear these conversations lately around like, we just have to give mushrooms to homeless people. And I'm like, well, we have to have some of our basic needs met before I think people can be even close to ready for these kinds of experiences. And like, say it's an unhoused person who's got substantial substance abuse issues, like, throwing them into an iboga ceremony, like, cool in theory, but like it's an incomplete theory because it's not taking into account so many other things. Like, how cold and scared are you going to be that night?
Yeah, it's like, let's get them with addiction and mental issues with a house. And then let's ride that off
some
for
sort
a
of
little
food
bit.
Security.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We were talking to one organization here in Texas that works really well with the unhoused, and we were open to doing a partnership, but I think it's because it would have been with people who were able to. I think they had a sort of like tiny home community. I could be getting that wrong, but it was something like that where we knew if we entered into it, there was at least some sort of stabilization there. But it's something I really think about a lot, because I mean, talk about privilege. It's a privilege to be able to be like, okay, the structures around my life are secure enough that I can actually, get a little unwound a bit. And I think it's really tricky for a lot of the people that we help that, some of them do have that for sure. But, we're helping people with financial instability, and kind of inherently in that is, often some amount of life instability. Or even if it's not life instability, it's like where we're at right now is we're hanging on by a thread. And so, if there's a disruption to that, it could really tilt things in a bad way. So it's definitely something that we pay attention to. And yeah, it's just fundamentally tricky. And yeah, I mean, the main thing that has me focus on at the moment is, the privilege to actually let myself break down a bit is, there's some real resources, inner and outer, that are needed for that to feel okay. Mm-hmm. And then, in some ways, I really do like ketamine as a sort of entry point, especially for people in those spaces, because at the same time, you know, if somebody has a lot of SI going on, a lot of suicidal ideation going on, that is inherently destabilizing. And yet, you know, ketamine could actually be something that like gets them back on track. And yes, I don't have a clear answer, but I think there's like a piece.
Well, there's
a
these
piece of
softer
each of
drugs
those there. Totally.
Softer drugs, ketamine, MDMA, that are like, you know, you can titrate to effect. You can run them through a normal protocol, like, and they're way less intense than classical psychedelics and like the, you know, mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca frame. And, you know, have you heard of this term ontological shock?
I've heard the term, but will you explain ontological?
Yeah. It's like, what is true? It's like this branch of philosophy is like the study of like, what can we know? What is true? Things like that. Like ontos, I think, being like knowledge maybe. And it's this idea that all of a sudden you come back and everything you thought was like the foundations of your reality that you've been building for, you know, the decades of your life are potentially untrue based on your lived experience in the session. And you can just say, oh, that was just a trip, it's a whatever, but it was a lived experience that you had that you should really be spending time trying to figure out, and figuring out what that means for the rest of your life, for the rest of your week. Like how, so you had this mystical experience, or you talked to your ancestors, and what's next? You know, is it yet another Costco run and upgrade your TV next month? Or is it like, let me actually sit down and journal and like, you know, find some people I can chat with about the, you know, seriousness of this. You know, like, I guess it's okay to upgrade your TVs, folks, but like, you know, think about your priorities.
Reminds me of this one really strong mushroom experience I had in undergrad where, you know, looking back, we only did psychedelics a handful of times in undergrad, but they were very mystical. And this one, I was at this apartment building that was overlooking the Georgia Tech campus, and my fraternity house was in view. The management building where all my classes were in view. And as the mushrooms were coming on, it all just crumbled. The idea of money just crumbled, and basically everything I had been doing my whole life, it all just kind of crumbled. And there was this vast expanse of awareness, like present moment awareness. And yeah, in some ways it's like, no wonder I ended up taking the path that I did and didn't want to get some corporate job afterwards. But yeah, it's like, and again, I feel lucky that I had enough, that I was just, I don't know, able to navigate that myself. But yes, it's like, and I was at a perfect moment to navigate that because I was transitioning from undergrad into the world where there's a, you know, either way there's going to be, you know, stepping off of one stone onto the next stone. And so I feel appreciative for that. But yeah, it's like, if you've been standing on a certain stone of a career or whatever it might be for however long, and all of a sudden that crumbles, it's a lot for people.
I have this idea, came up in chatting with, sometimes I have to work to anonymize people in real time. So call it scientist. Scientist is a third generation Grateful Dead person. And like this idea of the family container, and probably broader kind of like cultural container for them, knew how to support it, right? In like a really interesting way. And I'm not shy to admit that like I've done it like a lot. And this is kind of a thing I'm struggling with a little bit lately. Like I've done a lot of inner work. And then at a certain point I'm like, okay, like how about I'm just going to do life and I'm going to do fun. And there's this like Jerry Garcia line, like I'm here for fun this time around. Like, and I'm like, okay, interesting. And like, not like I'm opposed to doing inner work, and I still do, but like my priority is like, you know, different kinds of psychedelic experiences now. like with people, often with a priority of funny. Like, how do I make this enjoyable and pleasurable, and like, laughing as much as possible for, sometimes days and days. And like, I will just say, in a generic sense, I'm not a first generation psychedelic person. I just didn't know it.
Wow.
Till somewhat recently. And like, meeting this person who had multiple generations of knowledge, like, it's the kind of thing where probably her grandma was at like acid tests and going on tour with the Dead, like, in the early days, and then her mom, same thing, and then like her, the same thing. It's like how lucky, but also how different, right? Like, I think about that with Zach Leary sometimes. He's just like inherited so much, and it's not even just through Tim. It's like he spent so much time with Ram Dass, John Lilly, like so many of these legends. That is like, it's a different category of psychedelic training that's not really accessible to anybody, right? Like, you see it kind of in like the Kung Fu movies where you're like, oh yes, we've been here for like 300 generations doing these forms. And like, we have this wisdom and blah, blah, blah. It's a little similar to that. But I think it's like just a really different frame. And like, I don't exactly know how to, like, what's the most important, what's the least important. But I think it's important to understand that diversity is really important, because not everybody's going to be this, jam band person. Not everybody's going to be even like a therapist or like going down these paths. There's many doorways, many paths. There's probably greater than 10 billion paths we can be taking, just based on how many people there are. So how do we really like do the work to discover what path is for us, and like regularly check in to say, okay, yes, I'm going to go this way now, and this way and this way. And, I looks out, maybe I have been on the right path for 15 years, just didn't feel like it. There's so many different ways that this stuff can unfold for people. And, I think respecting that is it's hard, because we want to think that the thing we're doing is the right thing, which might be the right thing for you, especially at this moment, but maybe in 4 years, it's a super wrong thing for you. Right. So life's complicated and we want simplicity, but I just don't think simplicity is on the menu if we're engaging in this stuff in a real way.
Agreed. And I really never thought about the kind of intergenerational lineage piece quite like you put it. And yeah,
third generation burners, right? Like, I was driving around in my art car, and I'm, somehow I have a 6-month-old on the car with their parents. I'm like, holy moly. Same jam.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, and for me, I feel like I've been on my path a long time, call it maybe 15 years or so. But that, what a difference if it was my whole life. And yeah, that my grandparents were really initiating all of this. In some ways, my hope is that the work all of us are doing in this industry will allow a lot more people a couple generations down to be those, second, third, fourth generation folks. Which reminds me of a theme that I often hear, especially in millennials, of like that somebody will express that they're really trying to break the intergenerational patterns and move through their intergenerational trauma. And it just seems to be a theme that's very alive for our generation. And kind of in the same vein, my hope is that we're able to activate as many people as we can to be that kind of turning point for their lineage, with or without psychedelics.
Yeah. There's so many practices that make psychedelics not necessarily required. Yeah. And I think that's something that drives me a little bonkers. I think Terence McKenna sold that message a little too hard. That like, meditation doesn't work. It's like, well, for what? For what doesn't it work? Let's get a little more specific. If your only goal for meditation is like nirvana or like a intensely mystical experience, perhaps there is some sort of non-drug technique that is quite available. And yeah, like not that we should discount drugs either. I think we should be really curious about what the possibilities here are, because we're really early still.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, I think breathwork is a great example of, within 3 hours, something very out of ordinary is available. And I think a lot about, something like those 10-day Vipassana meditation retreats. It's like not quite 3 hours, but within 10 days, we can take you there regardless of, or take you somewhere at least, regardless of your background in meditation. So I'm curious to go back to your ayahuasca experience. What were like the kind of like weeks, and especially because it was, you're only one and it took your depression away for 2 years. What were the weeks and months like afterwards? And, we talk a lot about integration, and I think sometimes very intentional integration is really necessary and or helpful. And also, I think sometimes it kind of just takes care of itself in a certain sort of way. So yeah, just curious, like what happened afterwards, and how you were thinking about your experience, and yeah, what kind of ontological shock you were going through.
I think I was lucky in that I didn't really have much ontological shock as a result of my years of being in this kind of applied philosophy framework with Dream Shadow, because my teacher Lenny was like, PhD philosopher, still is, he's still around, PhD philosopher and clinical psychologist as well. And, we had this kind of like interesting dance between the mysteries in the ancient world and what we were up to, and, the history of the 60s, his lived experience of the 60s, and how my own mystical pursuits outside of psychedelia, even, right? Like religious mystical stuff going on like outside of this whole framework. So I'm like, okay, cool. This just like validates a lot of that. I lived it, and like, okay, these people weren't lying to me, which is kind of nice to know that they weren't lying to me. And I think I had my integration practices from breathwork, and it was art, it was writing, it was sharing with people who were definitely safe to share with. It was really awkward to keep secrets from people, but I had to, right? It's kind of part of it. Tragically, for a lot of reasons, not just laws, but like, we call it sometimes Bambi and Godzilla. It's like you come out and you're effectively Bambi, and any stranger, any person that might not be safe can just squish you in a second, like Godzilla. So you have to be really careful. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And in Groff, and I think I was just doing this just as a matter of my practice. There was a lot of outdoor stuff. There's a lot of exercise. I think I was doing mountain biking and rock climbing, and, just generally being outside in nature a lot. And I think this is an apt title for a book, Christopher Ryan's Mating in Captivity, around like we're effectively supposed to be running around in the wilderness, like in the woods, like most of the time, and evolutionarily speaking, and we've based on the lived built environment and like how we want to interact with culture, and some of us want to acquire assets like homes and cars and stuff like that. We get effectively we become captive, and that to me is something that needs to be examined, and like how do we become more physical. And so I think this is an extension to how often we think about integration and Vital and Psychedelics Today. It's like, it's not just the workbooks. It's not just like, meditate twice a day and eat healthy. Like that's part of it, or can be part of it. It's not necessarily the case that you need to do what anybody tells you. Maybe you need to do what works for you. But being outside, being physical, being embodied, those are, very privileged things, honestly. But also, if we're going back to like how we evolved, like really helpful. Groff even talks about how weightlifting is the thing that like would be really good for a lot of people in terms of getting back in their bodies and, understanding how amazing it is to have a body. This is kind of where, even things like poetry could be used. Like I remember Lenny, like my teacher, talking about some kind of mystic, romantic poet, talking about just how like you could be captivated by how incredible an invention the human hand is. Like you could be just captivated for hours going like, how amazing that I get to inherit this invention, this accident, theoretically, of evolution, right? And like, the mystical wonder in the mundane, and poetry can help with that. Art can help with that. And music has helped me a lot. So when I was having moments, I would, find music to help accentuate those moments because, I didn't want to hide them. I knew that I needed to feel them in a big way. So, I remember many times just driving down the highway playing like, that Bon Iver album. It's like really beautiful, kind of like ghosty and sad. And I would like on repeat, on repeat using, before I understood Palo Santo could be a little problematic, just like burning Palo Santo, like Bon Iver crying up a storm and like working through things. And like in the day to day, which I can't say that was necessarily on the tail end of the ayahuasca. It was maybe a year or two later. But like, I think, feeling things, being embodied, like figuring out how to like really lean in to what's coming up for you and being curious about your experience and not being afraid of what's going on in you can be really helpful. And as we get older, it makes more sense to be afraid, tragically, of what's inside us. And that's, this is why the childlike thing that can happen from play can be really important. I just said goodbye last night to like a lot of friends. We just had the most beautiful weekend, and I was just like crying as I was leaving, just going like, oh my God, I can't believe I just got to have that with all those people for so long. I'm crying now thinking about it. I'm just like, oh my God, how lucky, how beautiful, and how I'm going to miss it until the next time, and how happy I'm going to be the next time. And it's just so great. And this is, I think, part of like becoming a more full spectrum human. It's kind of like, get that Japanese idea of like warrior poet. But I think like in this day and age, it's like a little more full spectrum than that.
I love that. And one thing I hear in that is just like feeling, letting myself feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Like it's okay to feel angry sometimes. It's okay to feel horribly stuck and desperate sometimes. But like, this is also going to pass. This is also going to pass. This is fleeting. This is where like, I think, I don't know if you've read this book. I just finished it recently. How to Be Sick by this.
No. It's
really, really good, especially for people with chronic illness and or people dying in their lives. And she's kind of like, I think she was a law professor that became chronically ill. And I think she was at UC Davis. I'll get you the author in a sec here. Tony Bernhard.
Yeah.
And it was really exquisitely done because she's telling her own story. She's telling stories about other people who are chronically ill and how lessons from Buddhist psychology, not just from like, Vajrayana traditions, but also like Theravada traditions. And, I loved it. And I got to see Jack Kornfield. So one of my peak experiences in like psychedelic legacy stuff was this 5 or 7 day retreat at the Omega Institute in New York with Jack Kornfield and Stan Groff. And It was effectively like, a lot of Vipassana meditation, a lot of breath work, and a lot of effectively like darshan, just those two just giving amazing, brilliant lectures like every single day. And like, I was seeing a lot of that stuff reflected in here because she's also quoting not just Jack, but like the Goenka traditions and like, ancient manuscripts like Diamond Sutra stuff. And I'm like, oh, this is like really exquisite book, especially for folks who don't have any grounding in Buddhism and Buddhist thinking I don't identify as Buddhism, or Buddhist, but I know for sure that there's a lot of wisdom there, and helpful stuff. And yeah, I really appreciated that. And there's a lot about feeling it. Just going, okay, this is what I'm feeling now. I am not my sadness, but like, let me feel this and let it come through. And like that like a little bit of space you can give yourself from like feeling and like who and what you are is like really powerful.
Yeah, well said. And I think that's why mindfulness and things like parts work or IFS have been so helpful these days, because I find they both just give us that little bit of distance. So yeah, I'm experiencing this. I'm not fully this thing, which, you know, reminds me of the kind of classic experience that a lot of people will have on, or specifically in like psychedelic therapy, where they see, oh yeah, my sadness is here, or whatever it might be, my loneliness is here, and there's also this whole expanse of awareness here, and that's just like one little part of what's going on. And I think often, especially if we don't have any of these tools, we just are fully enveloped by the sadness or loneliness or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah, it's yeah. Another extension here, Kevin, is like what is possible for humanity? What is possible for a human? And this is like an extension of the human potential movement, like out of Esalen, which had a lot of precursors, but I think there's just so much more that we can become. And I think, you know, there's this, it's tragic because it's so part of our culture, but you know, this idea of like very conventional relationship elevator stuff. It's like not what I want, it's what is expected of me, and that's what I'm going to do. And then similarly, like, okay, I need the job, I need the degree, I need the house, and I need the house to look this way. And like, you know, that necessarily excludes a lot of optionality for you as a human. And I was chatting with somebody the other day about how like, it's very normal and part of the culture in like places like Hong Kong or all over Europe, where people have like gigantic apartment buildings, but right outside can be beautiful culture, beautiful plazas, beautiful art everywhere. And you're not like fully occupied by home ownership. I got into buying a house very young, and it like definitely impacted me in a really hard way for a long time. And I'm definitely not doing that now, but like I think about that and think about like, okay, like, are these the shackles I want right now? And I want people to know this stuff's optional. And have you bumped into Bruce Damer and Center for Minds yet in Austin?
No, I have not. Please share.
Okay. Yeah, this is something that you're definitely gonna, I think, want to bump into. So they got some good financing. Center for Minds. Jim Fadiman in his early days was doing this research with this guy Willis Harmon in Palo Alto, I think the Institute for Advanced Study maybe there. And then they were doing creativity work with LSD. Fadiman talks about it in his book pretty clearly, in pretty plain language. And the idea was they brought together architects, scientists of all stripes, and the criteria was you need to be stuck on a problem for at least 6 months and have been working on it for a long time. And they would have these people come over, you know, kind of like whiteboards and paper and everything, and they have their own little kind of like, not exactly cubicle, but like, you know, trip workspace. They would give them classical music and 100 micrograms of LSD. They would lay down for an hour, and then they would come out. And the idea was like for that time, like thinking about your problems through the peak of it. Which 100 mics is no joke. It's substantial enough to like, I don't know. I have to think seriously if I'm going to do 100 micrograms. It's not trivial. I have to think harder if I do more. But yeah, they would be cranking out solutions to these problems in a handful of hours. And eventually it was working so good that they had to bring more problems to solve. And we have those classic stories like Francis Crick. We've got the PCR guy. I forget what that was. theoretically jobs and others, but like, how do we unlock our potential in a way that's really helpful for us and for humanity? And I think that's what Center for Minds is doing. They're going to be taking this kind of like slower scientific approach, but studying people who are out there doing it already, and trying to come up with a way to actually test this in a laboratory. Like, okay, what methods produce the best results? And why I like this is that, given our precarious situation on the planet, we need more amazing engineering solutions than ever before, and scientific breakthroughs than ever before. So like, what if our engineering, started becoming like, 20-fold better, 100-fold better? What if we had 100x cheaper solar, or 100x better solar, or batteries, or whatever it is? And then, we can stop doing the fossil fuel thing so much. We can, theoretically understand molecules better, make better drugs, save more lives. Hopefully start thinking more long term too. Like, even if we get rid of all the carbon, like, we still have this problem where us just using electricity is eventually just going to heat the planet on its own. So we need to like come up with solutions there. Like, where should we be living in what way, and what should we be doing where? Like, there's a lot of really interesting problems that even folks like Tim Leary were thinking about a long time ago. So I think there's a lot of possibility. And like re-examining everything from like medicine to birth to family structures. Like, is the nuclear family really the ideal family structure? Like, I don't know. I think there's some inherent problems. I'm not the therapist, but I think there's some issues that we need to look at.
I like it if it was embedded in community. To me, the issue is that it's really often now separated out from community, and so yeah. But not to go down that rabbit hole, what I was thinking as you were describing that is, something my supervisor shared with me, kind of the same idea, but just on the individual level, and how often at first it's a lot of like trauma work. So with psychedelics and one's own path in general, and kind of combing over, the programming that we came up with, the pain points from early stuff, etc. And then at a certain point, well, on one hand, all of that needs to be replaced with something. If I get rid of some old pattern or heal some old pattern, there can't just be a void there. I need to come up with more positively oriented things to replace it. And what often emerges is like the shift from like healing to like life fulfillment kind of stuff. I don't know, I just think of like Maslow's hierarchy. Again, going from like healing to like self-realization sorts of stuff. And on the societal level, I think of like healing generational trauma, and then emerging into, could be, spiritual, mystical kind of stuff, but it also could be, technology and helping us live here better. So I love that as a framework, and something for us to keep in mind too. Like, yet I think, at least with my work at the moment, I feel so surrounded by like just the trauma work that needs to be done, and that might be here for a few more generations. But I mean, these things are also not mutually exclusive, especially for people who are already exploring those things. And the other thought I had about it is like this idea that, I don't think it's too crazy to say, psychedelics could really be the center point of our societies, for all of these sorts of reasons, because they can enhance so many different things. They enhance psychotherapy, make it deeper, quicker, better. It enhances spiritual connection, makes it deeper, quicker, better. Enhances technology and innovation, so to speak.
Exactly. Maybe once trauma gets out of the way, the creativity just flows better. Assuming you understand this, it's your profession, but like getting trapped in that kind of like cycle, like I have to fix the next thing. Maybe you do, but maybe it's okay to live for a little while too and have a balance of some kind.
Yeah, I appreciated you sharing all that stuff, and it's very, very relevant to me too. And more I've been orienting around play, just the idea of play and letting myself play. Yeah, some people often say that I seem very serious, which I think is true. And I think there's like a sincerity and focus to it, but also, yeah, like I could also use more play.
There's this one project I've been working on lately that I think kind of, in a way, can re-enable play. I'm involved in these two organizations, Remap Therapeutics and the Psychedelics and Pain Association, and we're trying to figure out how to leverage psychedelics and contemporary medicine and kind of the latest data on psychedelics and pain for chronic pain treatments, because chronic pain, broadly, if you include headaches, is one of the most disabling conditions in the world. Like, people are disabled. They're actually kind of pulled out of their family lives and friend lives, social lives, because they're just, I don't want to go to this thing because I'm going to be in so much pain. Like, why would I want to do that? And similarly to trauma, like if you can work through it, you can get your life back in a real meaningful way. And, there's been some, really interesting case studies coming out of those two projects. And I'm hopeful that we can get a lot of people back. I like to say this is kind of like an all hands on deck moment on the earth. And it's not necessarily the case that, everybody needs to drop everything and go into conservation or climate activism or whatever, but like just getting them back in their lives into a less like painful state, both, psychologically and physically. We get people back and we get families back, and like healing happens, and, hopefully people can collectively make better decisions about like where to spend their time and resources. And I think it's a big project, but I think, the pain work I'm just really, really fascinated by. And it's kind of, I think we got the therapy mostly covered, but like, how do we then go into like the different arenas where this could help people medically that might not need therapy?
Totally. And I love that phrase. I think that's one of my favorite things that I get to hear with the work that we do, is like, I got my life back. And no small thing.
Right. It's like, it's a big deal. And then I start hearing about the broader implications of the drug war from like Carl Hart's work. And really similarly, even if you get out of jail, it might not be the case that you can even visit your family for a lot of reasons. And like, it goes into addiction problems as well, similar issues. And it's like, it's this idea of, even after you're done being incarcerated, having incredible restrictions on yourself is like bonkers, and often for nonviolent offenses. Why are we doing this? Why is this where our resources are going? When there's kids that still can't eat enough calories in a day in this country and around the world. But bonkers that it's still the case here.
Yeah, it's overwhelming to try to figure out systems and structures for 350 million people.
And I think it's part of what psychedelics helps us, like, to like, holy shit, but like, let me do 2 or 3 problems. I don't need to tackle 100 or 20,000 problems. I can 1, 2, or 3 problems is like, that's plenty. Like, you don't need to do everything, guys. And I think a lot of people in this like semi-progressive movement around psychedelics and wanting to like help the world feel better and have less suffering, like, we want to tackle on everything because we have that level of compassion, but focused compassion might be better.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, we've often all had a vision of where all the problems are gone, and so it's it's hard to like narrow down and pick. Yeah, and I think it's incredibly difficult and complicated to come up with something that will work for 350 million people. And then on top of that, we're not creating it in a vacuum. We're also having to shift. There's just so much inertia with like the kind of system that's already here. So it's a lot. I think one final question I have for you, and I'm happy to kind of take this wherever it will, and then we can wrap up, is I guess something about what you see, where you see that we're at today in terms of the psychedelic industry. And that could be things that are happening that are really interesting to you. It could be frustrations that you have with certain things that you see. Could be, ideas that you have about, what might be coming politically or federally or state-based, kind of anything.
So one thing that really kills me is this semi-intentional othering of people outside of our communities, outside of psychedelic world. And, we're all made of the same stuff. We all have a really similar spark inside of us. And how do we figure out ways in which we're being really inclusive and also not harming with our language? And yes, psychedelics are amazing. And here's a really edgy thing that I'll say is opioids are amazing. Amphetamines generally are pretty amazing for the right categories of people. I've had fentanyl a lot of times because I've had a lot of surgery. I think that drug is amazing. And not being specific enough with our language and potentially being harmful with our language is something that I think this scene can do a lot better. And I think this scene needs to be reading more broadly. Okay, you've read 10 books on ayahuasca in a row. Cool. What's next? You've been to Peru 20 times in the last 6 years. Cool. What's next? Yeah, it's cool to hang out and wear neat clothes with your friends and feel super spiritual. Totally do that. I do that. But how do you say, okay, how am I also helping the world? What are things I could be doing in the world that are harming the world? So I want to bring this down to drug policy and psychedelic exceptionalism, because that's kind of what I'm beating around the bush with. It's
Got it, yeah.
I'm a really good person because I do ayahuasca. I'm a really good person because I only do psychedelics, right? I think, the only drug I get a little judgy around is cocaine, and that's specifically because of how much blood there is in the supply chain. And most other drugs don't have that brutal of a supply chain. And it's not the drug's fault. It's not the manufacturer's fault. It's the U.S. federal government's fault. And we can do things to change that because we're ostensibly a, democratic republic, and we have influence over laws. And, I'm not saying Joe's mission is legalizing cocaine. I don't even really use cocaine. I've tried maybe twice and I fail and it doesn't work. I know people that have ADD and they try it and they fall asleep, so it's not for everybody.
Fascinating.
I think similar to Adderall, right? People have different reactions to Adderall based on their neurotype and chemistry and whatever else is going on. And things work differently for everybody. And we have to figure out how do we respect everybody's diversity and say oh, cool. Maybe it's the case that not everybody needs to have kids. I remember some politician recently saying, you're a psychopath if you don't want or have kids. Right? I'm oh, good. Glad you have power. Okay. And then similarly, there was some signaling a while ago from one of our last presidents where he was applauding this Filipino president for executing people who were using methamphetamine even once, because there was a study that we published at NIDA, Carl Hart talks about this a lot, suggesting that the brain is damaged after you use methamphetamine. And NIDA does a lot of this really pro-drug war research, or at least historically has. And it's how they get their funding, right? If drugs are scary and bad, then I can get more funding because our institute is around drug abuse. And there's probably some sort of complex in being in cahoots with DEA because they have similar funding structures. And And then I started reading recently, I don't know how I missed this, a lot of our foreign aid, we send a lot of foreign aid around the world. A lot of the foreign aid comes with strings attached around fighting the drug war, which is like, well, what about like infrastructure and feeding people so there's less poverty? And, it's not necessarily the case that every kid grows up like being really over the moon about joining some sort of illicit cartel situation somewhere. Like they probably want to help people. Like, the fireman, doctor, astronaut thing, it's not that, it's kind of universal, we want to help people. And, it's so how do we get away from this narrative that makes other people bad? And how do we get towards this narrative where things can change, nothing is static, everybody has their own North Star inside, people can get co-opted, right? Like, I think, we do a lot of really kind of, as a culture, not great conversations around veterans. And like, I was just at the Heroic Hearts Project Gala in LA the other day, and it's a big topic for me. And I think the military industrial complex takes advantage of youth. And like the prefrontal cortex is not there. And like, let's go send these muscly dudes over to these super skinny 16-year-olds and go, yo, you guys should join up. It's tight. Like, you travel the world, you get to be rough, and people like you. And like, like there's something amazing about doing service, but I think like there's also problems. And like, we have to, if we're doing a sales pitch to somebody, like, how do we be a little bit more authentic about that? But it's hard to do that with, voluntary military service. And then we end up with what we have today, which is like really tragic figures around military veterans and suicidality, and even veteran wives and spouses. The suicide rate is pretty substantial there too. So there's a lot we need to figure out. And psychedelic exceptionalism doesn't help. I was talking with somebody, and we had to chop it from the episode. She works with veterans a lot. She's like, people find what works for them, and potentially patterns that they don't want can stay there. But, maybe it's the case that they needed to start drinking to like be able to be stable, because, navigating the VA can be really hard. Navigating healthcare in America can be really hard. Like I've had resources in the past. I don't really have those kind of resources anymore. Like I had Easy Street for a while. I had medical easy mode, and now I have medical hard mode. And I'm like, this is, it's educational for me. I'm kind of happy I have that right now. But like, I can't imagine being even, more resource poor. And like, okay, methamphetamine is what's getting me through my day. Like, I know that starting Friday afternoon, I can do that. And like, cool, I'm refreshed and I can get through a horrible work week again. Like, how do we have compassion for that?
100%. And yeah, like that is absolutely the lens that I hope we all look at, anyone suffering with addiction sort of stuff through. Like, this was their best attempt at helping themselves.
Mm-hmm. And how do we create structures that can keep them safe, get them access to help when they want it? I'm a little worried about kind of forced treatments over the next handful of years. I'm worried about the ones that are already there right now. Like, okay, the judge says you have to go to AA. It's like, well, there's other options. There's other options. And how about we give them a number of options that you have to do this? I think the TV series Louder Milk did a good job kind of showing that, about forced treatment. And maybe they glorified the process a little bit, but like they at least discussed it. I think that was important. And like, how do we just, say like laws and culture aren't static, they're dynamic systems. And we need to say like, what are the things feeding back into it that keep it in this less than optimal way? And what are things that we can slowly implement to work towards a more optimal way of being? And watching our language in this community is a big part of that. I'm thankful that people are stopping saying crackhead, so much race overtone built into that. And like, it's not appropriate to say it. And it just denigrates a huge portion of people in a really unhelpful way. If what we're going for is how do we help each other, keep people out of jail, make sure they don't die from overdoses, and we have some sort of safe supply. And, we're slowly getting there. I've been beating this drum for too long. I think I've lost a lot of friends over it, which I'm fine with. But like, I think it's just important, like how, a lot of us know people who have died from contaminated drug supply, and it's just not something that we should keep doing. How do we get better? Yeah. It's a long project.
A lot of what I hear in here is compassion, just having a lot of compassion for really everyone in their unique situation. And, so I went to Naropa, and what I was so grateful to learn there is this idea of basic sanity. Another sort of version of it is like an innate healing intelligence. So to really have this view of people that they are doing the best that they can with what they have. And I know it's been helpful for me to like more and more really get that I would be making the decisions that they're making if I was in their context and feeling the things in my body that they're feeling inside of their body, and having the thoughts that they're having. And I don't want to be like reductionist about that, but just from like an empathetic and compassionate standpoint is like, I think one of my assumptions here in what we're talking about is there's a lack of compassion, especially with the, like a term like crackhead, which is like, oh, why did they make such poor decisions? Or like, why don't they just stop? And, I've heard that from some older generations a lot about a number of kind of drug things. And yeah, to me, it's just such a lack of understanding of the repercussions of trauma and instability. And
race and class baked into it too. I was chatting with somebody the other day.
Sure.
Was super interested. She's a sociologist at a university, and said, psychedelics aren't necessarily a safe drug for all communities and all colors. And like, think about being, very into LSD and mushrooms and living in like the poorest parts of Atlanta or New York City. And like, like maybe stimulants are the thing that's a lot safer to do for that person in that context. And isn't that sad in a degree? Like I don't want to like, downplay that some people really like that stuff. There's a little bit of like drug shaming in the way I put that, but like there's a certain category of experiences they're locked into. A lot more options.
Yeah. And I get the thing of like, yeah, what's going to be safe is what is not going to be questioned, and what other people around me are doing.
Right. But being high on LSD and walking around those neighborhoods, like that's potentially really exposing like a real physical safety angle, right? Like police and or, violence or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like the stimulant sounds like a better thing if actually like being on edge and being in a bit of a fight-flight state is actually like survivally like helpful in a survival sense.
An evolutionary, at least survival advantage.
Totally. Yeah. Which is an interesting kind of point there. It's like, if we come from this context, which I think is basically true, is, okay, we're all going to do some sorts of substances. Which ones are the most evolutionarily beneficial for me in my context? And I mean, I think for a lot of this population, it's like caffeine and alcohol, and we take them at different times for different things. But then, yeah, to your point, like for that context, things that keep me sharp, at least temporarily, would be more beneficial than, yeah, something like LSD could be so troubling in an unsafe environment.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, yeah, we have a long way to go. We're really early days in this whole project, everybody. And like, I want people to know that there's a lot left to research. There's a lot left to implement. And yeah, we just have a long way to go here.
Yeah, that was a thought I was just having, is this feels like very much being in the middle of a very long ongoing conversation. Yeah, there's a lot left unknown and kind of undecided.
Yeah, and giving people like a historical context, like this is what we've been doing for the last many thousands of years, at least in the West. Like everything's kind of like a part of this discussion between Plato and Aristotle, and it's been iterating and growing, and that's, you know, we're 2,000 plus years later, still having very similar debates. And like having context from the ancient world is really helpful, and through the rest of history is really helpful. So like, you know, pick up some philosophy once in a while, and not just, you know, don't just read something like Bertrand Russell, because it's like, you know, tickling your logic centers. Like pick up some poetry too, pick up some Plato, things like that. Round it out. Let's get more well-rounded if we can.
I think it's a good place to pause.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. This is fun.
This was fun. Yeah, thanks so much for being on. And yeah, perhaps we can do this again.
Love it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to the Thank You Life podcast. If you would like to get involved with our mission and help more people in need access ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, please consider becoming a monthly supporter. Donations are the sole means through which we provide financial assistance to our beneficiaries, and we currently have close to 1,000 people in need on our waitlist. This work could not happen without our generous supporters, so if you've been touched by hearing these stories of healing and want to make an impact, please consider visiting our website, thankyoulife.org, and becoming a monthly supporter.